I want to go to the lawyers. I want to get three opinions on this because it was so stunning to me. The revelation that the president's lead defense lawyer in the Senate trial was in the room during an incriminating element of this story that John Bolton would testify to, that lawyer, Pat Cipollone, knew John Bolton would testify to. Maya, I want to start with you on this. There's just so many angles to this that it was just stunning to hear this.
I was shocked. I was shocked for a couple of reasons. One is because as a White House counsel, he's the people's counsel, meaning he is not representing Donald Trump as a person. He's representing the office of the president. So to the extent that he's now sitting in the well of that Senate and not disclosing to senators that as he sits there, he himself is a fact witness to something that they are arguing about, including arguing the facts and whether the Senate needs the facts. And here's this explosive fact that goes straight to the heart of whether or not there was corrupt intent. Now, maybe based on what happened in that room, there is a legal argument for why it was not corrupt intent. But he is tainted by not representing in a fair and transparent way that he has information about it. Really, he shouldn't have been sitting in the well of that of the Senate. And it just makes clear how Donald Trump has found a way to corrupt, whether it's a legal corruption or just an ethical corruption, to corrupt every aspect of the institutions of government. I
think we know why Donald Trump wanted Pat Cipollone as a lawyer in the case, because he's free, absolutely free. He's on the White House payroll, doesn't have to pay room. Chuck, when the president says to Pat Cipollone, I want you defending me in the United States Senate impeachment trial, does Attorney Cipollone have an obligation to say to the president, I cannot do it. I am a potential fact witness in this case. I cannot possibly represent you under those circumstances.
I think even more than that, Lawrence, to Maya's point, and this is really important, so let me restate it briefly and then answer your question. Mr. Cipollone, as the White House counsel, represents the institution, the office of the president, not an individual. Now, there's no question that a White House counsel ought to be involved in some way if there's an impeachment proceeding, because there are institutional interests at stake.
Especially in a liaison-like connection to the defense team.
Absolutely. Yep. But to your question now, it's black letter law, and we call something black letter law if it's very clear in the law. There's no question about it. It's black letter law that a lawyer cannot be a witness in his own case. It calls into question the integrity of the proceeding. Every state bar in the United States would tell you that. And so, is that an issue? Well, if true, it's an issue.
Glenn, that was my next point. What does this do to him with the Bar Association? Is this a disbarable line that he's crossed?
The state bar that he is a member of will, I believe, open an investigation. They will decide if there was wrongdoing, ethically, legally, or otherwise. And if so, they will decide what the sanction should be. But, you know, this is big ticket, unethical conduct at a minimum. And with this Bolton revelation that compromises Cipollone, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, who wasn't in the loop? At this point, so many people are being implicated in, at a minimum, ethical missteps that I am glad to hear you open with. John Bolton will testify.
Yes.
Because oversight doesn't stop because impeachment may end up not turning out the way the Democrats wanted. 75% of the people want to hear witnesses. So it is the House's responsibility to continue to conduct oversight now that Cipollone has been implicated, now that Parnas has said some really damaging things about Giuliani, about Barr, by extension about the president. Oversight doesn't stop. The American people deserve to hear from these witnesses.
And thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.